distinct honor to thank the committee. I ask that you give the committee that put this together another round of applause. Again, thank you to Wayne Risa and Westwood Community Schools on this outstanding partnership. And I also thank our state superintendent for being committed to the work. And I'd be remiss if I didn't start this way, although I was given a tailored speech to start to introduce our state superintendent. So I'm going to say this. We recognize Dr. Rice for serving and serving well. His service to the 1.4 million scholars across this great state has not gone unnoticed. We celebrate him and his tenure as an unapologetic champion for children and an advocate for public education. Yes, he has announced his retirement, but what we know is that we will just continue to look forward to his next chapter because he is not finished yet. Now I invite our 44th state superintendent of public instruction, who has worked with the State Board of Education, governor, legislature, and education community to fund programs to address teacher shortage, better support teachers and other staff members, better fund children's mental health and school safety, expand early childhood education, strengthen the state's literacy laws, expand advanced placement, career technical education, and dual enrollment programs, and has increased graduation rates. He began his career in public education 4 decades ago. He looks that young as a high school French teacher and speech and debate team founder and coach. His greatest joy in his job continues to be visiting with Michigan students, Michigan scholars, Michigan learners across this great state in all of the schools in which he serves. I can just share with you that he may look barely alive, but he has more energy than all of us put together. Please welcome Dr. Rice. Let's give him some Wayne County love.
Thank you, Dr. Colbert, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Westwood Community Schools. I want to thank Deputy Superintendent Beth Gonzalez. I want to thank the Summit Planning Team, MDE's Teaching Comprehensive History team, and those of you who every day bring content and clarity and light and knowledge to our young people. So when I began to reflect upon remarks for this introduction, I began to think about acronyms. We think about acronyms in the department, and I thought, this is a WTH moment, right? It's a why teach history moment. And then I thought, no, it's not sharp enough. It's a particularly fraught moment. And I thought, no, it requires a WTF, or maybe even a WTF-H. Why teach future historians and educators? As you know, this kind of distills in a fashion to why teach comprehensive history to children. Why teach it all to children? It was Randall Robinson, founder of Trans-Africa, the inveterate anti-apartheid freedom fighter, who once said, I knew about Moses in utero, but what I didn't know about was Zipporah, his wife, who was Ethiopian and Black, and I needed to know that. I needed to know that. He said, we used to hear a lot of expressions coming up. He said, people used to say, from here to Timbuktu. But no one told us that Timbuktu was Timbuktu, Mali, West Africa. A civilization of great culture and education and Black. And I needed to know that. My own epiphanies about history growing up were few. History Day competition in 8th grade, we explored Paul Revere's ride and discovered, come to find out, that Paul Revere's ride wasn't a solo ride, number one. He had done it with Charles Dawes and Samuel Prescott. That the three of them had gotten captured, who knew? And that while Dawes and Prescott continued to warn that the British were coming, the same was not true for Revere. He didn't get to continue his ride. But that brief glimpse about the incompleteness, read inaccuracy of history came and went in my educational career. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, birthplace of aviation. We were taught to be proud that we were coming up in the same town that the Wright brothers had come up in, the founders, the inventors of flight, of the airplane. What we weren't taught was that it was also the birthplace of Paul Laurence Dunbar, the famous U.S. poet and Black. And what we certainly weren't taught, apart from Dunbar's writing, was that Dunbar and Orville Wright somehow went to the same high school together. Almost 100 years before my cohort of young people, my classmates and I, were part of Dayton desegregation. How is it possible that we were part of a Dayton desegregation plan when almost 100 years earlier, here's a noted Black poet, before he became a noted Black poet, with what would be an inventor, the birthplace of flight. We never heard any of that. And we needed to know that coming up. We also didn't learn much about members of tribal nations beyond this picture. We never learned about disrespect, or disease, or death, or theft, or the Trail of Tears. We didn't know about it. We needed to know about it. But at the end of the day, this is not a presentation about what Randall Robinson or Michael Rice or any of you needed to learn when we were coming up. Because the fact of the matter is, educators, we can't build a better past. We can only build a better present and a better future. So that's what this conference is about. It's about building a better present and future for our young people. So I'd like to focus on the U.S. Constitution, if I could, for just a moment, and particular words in the U.S. Constitution. So the Constitution, as you know, begins with "we the people" in order to form a more better, a more perfect union. Let's look at those 4 words. A more perfect union suggests that you were coming off of a perfect union. It has all sorts of ironies written into it. The Articles of Confederation certainly weren't perfect. The Constitution, though better, couldn't be more perfect. There's no such thing as more perfect. But more important than that is the notion that the Founding Fathers realized that what they were engaged in was an experiment. The Articles of Confederation didn't have it right, nor the base Constitution. So how do I know that? Well, I know that because the ratification of the Constitution, 1788, included a number of requests, demands of colonies for then states to amend the Constitution beyond the base Constitution. The framers saw this coming. They included Article 5 in the base Constitution to show how to amend the Constitution. A lot of people talk about the Constitution as if it's rigid, as if it's inflexible, as if it's always been what it is today. Not the case. Founding fathers knew it was a living, breathing document, knew that it would need to be amended, and began to amend it right after they ratified the base Constitution. First 10 amendments, Bill of Rights, 1791. Let's hone in on 3 particular amendments if we could. And these are called the Civil War amendments, as many of you know, notwithstanding the fact that none of them were ratified during the Civil War. 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery for the formerly enslaved, December 1865. 14th Amendment, granting citizenship for the formerly enslaved, 1868. 15th Amendment, the right to vote for those formerly enslaved men, 1870. What to make of these amendments? I'm always amused by people who suggest that we should only teach history. We shouldn't include our own value propositions in history. Okay, fair enough. And just teach the facts. Fair enough. And I ask those people, would you argue that the U.S. Constitution is a part of the teaching of those facts? Absolutely. Would you argue that the U.S. Constitution should be treated in its fullness? Absolutely. Good. So let's look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You don't abolish slavery if you've not had slavery. You don't abolish slavery based on race if you didn't have it to begin with. To enslave a people based on race is to believe in the superiority of one group over another based on race. That is by definition racism. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are markers of progress. They're no more perfect than the rest of the Constitution. But they are indicators of a racist past in our country's history. That's inconvenient, but it's true. We have a responsibility to teach about the story in our classes, but also about the theory as well. To teach about the Constitution is inherently to teach about race and racism in the United States, and about a whole lot more as well. So why do we teach it all? Well, we teach it all to be more representative of people, themes, and movements, to be more honest, as Beth Gonzalez mentioned. But we also teach it all to engage children, to keep children on our history, to keep them on possibilities for their future. We try to help children draw connections for themselves between the history of the past and their present and future. We go back in time to inform the present and, by extension, the future. We go back in time to look at King, Dr. King, and his wife, Coretta Scott King, in India in 1959, studying Gandhian nonviolence principles. This is between the Montgomery bus boycott of 55 and 56 and the rise of the civil rights movement in the 60s. 1959, King takes 5 weeks with his wife, go to India to learn more about the principles of nonviolence, to come back and better lead in this country. We go back in time to learn about what will inform our present and future. And more importantly, our children are able to go back in time to learn about what can inform their present and their future, because we're training future historians, teachers. Children see human progress, Children see the potential of learning from the past and informing and bettering their present and future. Plug into our work because they recognize a value to what they want to do to improve their world. To teach it, of course, means we're less likely to relive the worst elements of it. History is a gateway to possibility for our children. Some people say, well, you're trying to raise up young activists. You're trying to raise up young people who are aware of their history to help inform how they can improve our world. Because I don't think, adult educators, that we've arrived quite yet. Amen?
Amen.
Teaching comprehensive history is an effort to expand opportunities, not to limit them. Some would argue, not to mention any names, the President of the United States, the U.S. Secretary of Education, some would argue that it violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to teach comprehensive history. In fact, the teaching of comprehensive history is positive sum, it's not zero sum. There are no winners, no losers, no preferences, and therefore no violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Teaching comprehensive history falls squarely under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, unapologetically. But like so many activities under this banner, it is not simply legal, it is pedagogically valuable. Children have a right to learn this history. We as educators have a responsibility to teach it, searing as well as soaring. I'm proud of some of the work of the last 7 years. I'm under no illusion that we don't have, in Frost's words, miles to go before we sleep. We have relatively new social studies standards. They permit a lot more latitude for teachers to teach the fullness of history than the preceding social studies standards did. We have a Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series, an outstanding webinar series, 41 webinars, 21 topics. Our university professors who are experts in particular areas, helping our K-12 educators who are generalists in their teaching of young people, helping them learn about labor rights, civil rights, disability rights, equal rights, and other movements. These webinars include the teaching of tribal nations, teaching about African Americans, about Latinos, Asian Americans. This is an important effort. So too is the Indigenous Education Initiative of the department, working with CMTED on history in Michigan effort, which is very different from the history taught in many, not all, but in many places across the state. And finally, the Section 99D work, which Beth Gonzalez, Dr. Colbert referred. This conference is funded as part of that $6 million from the state legislature just a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. But nothing is more important than the work that teachers do every day in their classrooms. Not simply because history happened is history important, but because of what it can do to inform present and future. And with a shout out to Biggie, if you don't know, now you know. I appreciate you. Have a great
Before we move to our keynote, as Dr. Colbert shared, and many of you know, Dr. Rice will be retiring in October. And while we'll miss his leadership in this capacity and the work he's done, the difference he's made will remain a lasting part of your legacy. Dr. Rice, in gratitude for your partnership and dedication, we'd like to present you with this framed print of a beautiful mural here in the city of Detroit by artist Myles. Johnson. May it serve as a reminder of the creativity, resilience, and history you've helped us honor and preserve. Please join us in giving me, please join me in giving Dr. Rice a round of applause. Now it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Hassan Kwani Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries is an historian and professor at The Ohio State University, specializing in African American history. His work has shaped how educators, students, and the public understand the civil rights movement and the long struggle for racial justice in America. He's the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement and the host of the widely acclaimed Teaching Hard History podcast. He created the Audible series Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement and authored Bloody Lowndes, a landmark study of civil rights and Black power in Alabama. Beyond his writing, Dr. Jeffries has brought history to life for millions. He served as lead scholar and scriptwriter for the $27 million redesign of the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and he chairs the board of the Montpelier Foundation, stewarding the estate of President James Madison. His expertise and perspective have been featured in the New York Times, NPR, CNN, MSNBC, and in the PBS and NBC documentaries like The Power and Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power. His TEDx talk, Why We Must Confront the Painful Parts of U.S. History, has been viewed over 2 million times. A graduate of Morehouse College and Duke University, and a proud son of Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Jeffries has been recognized with the 2023 Legacy and Legends Award from the King's Arts Center in Columbus, Ohio. We are truly fortunate to have him with us today. His voice, scholarship, and courage challenge us to see history in all its complexity and to embrace the responsibility of truth-telling in our classrooms and in our communities. You are all in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Hassan Kwani Jeffries.
Because I was out there, I was like, oh man. So it's wonderful to be here with you all. It's an honor. Thank you very much for the warm words. Welcome. I did not have Dr. Price quoting Biggie Smalls on a bingo card, but he said he had to show some love for Brooklyn, New York. So I appreciate that very much. It was either coming out to DMX, Who We Be, and we'll circle back to that before my time is up, or the Ohio State University fight song. I think I chose the right one. So I've titled my remarks for this morning, Teaching Diverse Histories During Troubling Times. Teaching Diverse Histories During Troubling Times. A couple years ago, January 18, 2019, it was the weekend of the MLK holiday, and I was asked by my youngest daughter's preschool teachers if I would speak to her class about MLK. I'm a girl dad. I have 3 daughters, and My two oldest daughters were now 15, 12, and 10. And my two oldest daughters had been in had the same teachers, and so I knew the teachers very well, and they knew I taught history at that school down south from here. And so they asked me, as I was dropping off my youngest daughter, Layla, that week, they said, Hassan, we're going to bring the girls to the school-wide MLK Day Assembly this year, as we've done in years past, but we want to do something different. We want to talk to the girls a little bit more about who Dr. King was. In years past, we've taken them to the assembly, and we don't feel that they get enough out of the assembly. And we know you teach African American history, and we thought it would be a good idea if you spoke to the girls in your daughter's class. And my immediate response was, hell no. And they looked at me, thought I was joking. I was like, I'm not joking. I was like, 4-year-olds scare me. My 4-year-old in particular scares me. He asks too many questions. They don't take no for an answer. They just go on and on and on. And to ease my anxiety, to convince me to speak to the girls about MLK, they said, well, look, some of the girls, they don't know that much about MLK. We asked them, what do they know? And one little girl raised her hand and said, well, we know he was killed. And another girl said, yeah, he was killed by dragons. And I looked, where did you get that from? She said, no, you gotta understand. These are 4- and 5-year-olds, right? They associate kings with fairy tales. And in fairy tales, kings are often confronted and killed by dragons. And I said, that doesn't make me want to do this any more than I did before. But with a little more cajoling, I agreed to talk to these 4- and 5-year-old young girls, 15 to 16 of them, about MLK. The question then became, how do I talk about MLK to 4- and 5-year-olds who don't have an experiential context of understanding who Dr. King was? And so I settled on talking to them about Dr. King as a child, growing up in Jim Crow, Georgia, segregated Georgia, and the things he couldn't do simply because he was African American. The schools he couldn't go to, the playgrounds he couldn't play on, the swimming pools he couldn't swim in, the friends he couldn't have. And then I said, after talking to them about King growing up, I'll talk about 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, and the Children's Crusade. Birmingham, Alabama, 63 was the most segregated city in America, and Dr. King goes there and helps lead this effort to end apartheid there. And what's critical to the success of Dr. King, of course, is children, young children, some as young as the 4- and 5-year-olds who I was speaking to. And I talked to them about kids marching and going to prison and going to jail alongside Dr. King. One child raised their hand, and this is when I started to get nervous. This is what I did not want to happen. And they said, well, were any of the children killed? And I said, thankfully, those who marched with Dr. King, none of the kids were killed. Then I talked to the girls about those children facing water hoses and dogs being sicked on them. Another little girl raised her hand and asked, well, where were the police when the dogs were let loose on the children? And of course, the police were the ones releasing the dogs. So we talked a little more about 63, talked about King not being killed by dragons, but actually being assassinated and what that meant. Had a few more questions, and then I got the hell out of there. And in the photograph below, the young girl with the white bow in her hair looking up intently at me is not my daughter. My one is in the back with the red bow and her head down. Like, what is this you talking about? and Layla is a very, inquisitive, always was, child. And so she didn't ask any questions that morning while I was presenting. Didn't have anything to say. Jumped in the car that afternoon, didn't have anything to say. And, this is my third daughter. I've been on this rodeo before. You just wait till your child is ready to have this conversation. So it was 11:30 at night, that night, and she was fumbling around in our bed. And I finally said to Layla, look, you gotta go to sleep, right? It's 11:30. You know, I know it's a Friday, but you know, you gotta go to bed. And she looked up at me and said, well, let's talk about Dr. King. I'm like, like, all right, you got 5 minutes to talk about Dr. King. And she began to recall and share what we talked about in class. She talked about King growing up in segregated Georgia, schools he couldn't go to simply because he was black. She talked about the children marching with Dr. King and having to face these thoughts. And then she said, almost verbatim, she said, but thankfully, none of the children were killed. And when I heard her say that, I realized that I had misspoken this morning. Because while it was factually true that none of the children who marched with Dr. King in April and May of 1963 were killed, of course that September 15th, 1963, 4 little girls in a church in Birmingham, 16th Street Baptist Church, and 2 young African-American boys were murdered at the hands of Klan. And when I realized that I had misspoken, I immediately interrupted her and I said, Layla, actually I was wrong. I misspoke. I said there were 4 girls who died because children marched with Dr. King. And without hesitating, she said, what were their names? And I began to recall their names. Cynthia Wesley was one. Then I said, hold on. I said, give me my phone, because you have my phone. I said, give me my phone. And if you Google 4 little girls, I said, I can show you their pictures. And you've seen the pictures, the grainy black and white school year photos of the 4 girls who died in Birmingham. And I pull up the images and I show them to Layla. And she looks and she points to one and she says, she looks like Asha. Asha is her older sister. In that moment, she was making a human connection to a grainy black and white photograph of a girl who was killed by racial terrorists more than 60 years earlier. And we talked a little more about those girls and children in the movement, and then finally her eyes really began to get heavy. And so I said, listen, close your eyes, you can go to sleep here, and I promise not to move you. Now you know that's not true. So she lays her head down, closes her eyes, and I begin to gather some clothes and stuff up. And 5 minutes or so pass, and I begin to tiptoe out of the room. And then I hear her say, she doesn't sit up, she doesn't roll over, she doesn't even open her eyes, her head is on the pillow. But she says, Daddy, I think he was trying to tell us America is damaged. Stopped me in my tracks. And I said, damaged? I had never heard her, 4 years old, I had never heard her not only not use the word damaged in proper context, I never heard her say the word damaged. She said damaged. She repeated damaged. And I said, Dr. King? She said, Dr. King does not roll over, does not look at me, does not say another word. I think he was trying to tell her that America was damaged. In that moment, I had 2 thoughts. One, I have been trying to figure out how to say and share for some 20 years at that point exactly what, with my students, exactly what Dr. King had been trying to tell us. And this motherfucker figured it out. That was the first thought. The second thought was, these kids are never too young to learn. Never too young to learn the hardest aspects of our past. We just have to get out of their way. They're never too young to learn, and they're also never too young to teach us if we listen. I think he was trying to tell us that America was damaged. It's exactly what Dr. King was trying to tell us, and that aspect, that realization that America is not perfect. Far from it. And America is damaged, has been damaged from the outset because of its investment in the institution of slavery. It gets at what I call hard history. And what do I mean by hard history? Hard history are those aspects, historical narratives, that challenge our national identity and self-perception. Those aspects about the past that make us uncomfortable in the present. Hard to think about, hard to teach, how to learn, how to talk about in the classroom and beyond. Hard history. Not necessarily because it should be, just because it is. Sometimes hard to recover. Histories of marginalized people. Hard history, civil rights movement, slavery, internment, detainments now. We're living through one of these moments we'll look back at and be like, this is some hard history. And diverse histories, in particular, are also hard histories. Those histories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past that contradict cherished narratives. Diverse histories often prove to be hard history. Now, in normal times, it's a challenge to teach these hard issues. It's hard to talk about white supremacy. It's hard to talk about racial violence being the cornerstone of slavery and the cornerstone of freedom during any period. But we find ourselves in a moment where we're also facing particular challenges. And this slide in particular I want to point out. The first is that we have to deal with is the myth of perpetual racial progress. So when we're thinking about teaching diverse histories, we have to confront this idea of the myth of perpetual racial progress. This is the idea that things may have been bad once in America, but they always get better. They always get better. Right? There was slavery, yes, but we had Reconstruction. We got some amendments to the Constitution. We're not going to talk about why Reconstruction was defeated. We're not going to talk about Jim Crow. We're going to jump right to Dr. King, writing a letter in jail. We'll talk about Dr. King writing this letter from jail, Birmingham jail, but we won't talk about the reasons why he was in jail in the first place. And then we'll go from Dr. King to Barack Obama, perpetual progress. And from Barack Obama to Beyonce, who's top in country music charts. Like, that's progress. But that's not the way that history unfolds. And that's not the way American history has unfolded. Because we also find in the classroom, we're also burdened by another myth, and that is that the arc of the moral universe, which we've all heard, the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends towards justice. And this becomes a challenge when we only leave it at that. Dr. King used to talk about the arc of the moral universe being long and bending towards justice, but adding that it will only bend in that way if people exert the force necessary to bend it towards justice. But framed in this way, one of the challenges that we face is that this notion that change only occurs because of the passage of time, rather than understanding that change occurs because people invest energy and sometimes their lives in creating change. The third challenge that we face in the classroom is that our students, as a reflection of the larger society, have a deep desire to be on the right side of history. Ohio, I just want to talk about Ohio for a second. Ohio, we'll leave Michigan out of this for a moment. You know, Ohio students, I realized when I moved there, I've been there for 25 years, that they suffer from what I call Underground Railroad-itis. It's one of the things that they all remember when they enter into the classroom. So if I'm teaching a course on U.S. history or African American history, I always like to ask my students in a hall this big, sometimes 100, 200 students in years past, and I'll say, you know, if we were living back then, raise your hand if you would have been a conductor on an Underground Railroad. In a hall with 100 students, 90 of whom are white, every hand will go up. They want to be on the right side of history. Then I got to break their little hearts. But listen, I need 99 of y'all to put your hands down. Because history doesn't bear that out. And they got to deal with that. What does that mean? But there's this deep desire to always position yourself on the right side of history. So therefore, you don't take the time to understand, well, who was on the wrong side and why were they there? Politics, one of the contemporary challenges that we face in the classroom is that our politics now have become like religion. There's only two, I have an older brother. Yeah, there's two topics, and you know, we grew up, you know, in Brooklyn debating, you know, everything, right? Sports, politics, music, we still do. But there's two topics we will not debate. We'll discuss, but we will not debate. The first is, we don't debate people's humanity. It's not a topic for debate. And the other thing we don't debate religion. We don't debate the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Because the Abrahamic religions all have at their center faith. Faith. And faith is ostensibly the belief in the absence of fact. This is what you believe. There's nothing that I can share with you that will move you off of that belief. That's the power of religion. That's the power of faith. Unfortunately, our politics on the right have become like religion. They're sharing ideas often rooted in history and bringing that into the classroom, sharing it with their children, and you can't move them off of that belief. There's no fact that you can share that will move them off of that belief. That's a challenge in the classroom when we're trying to deal with facts and not fiction. Politics as religion. And the other challenge that we face in the classroom is this idea of history versus nostalgia. History versus nostalgia. I have a friend, Reggie Gibson, who's a literary performer in the Boston area, and he said something that stuck with me. I've never forgotten when I heard him say this. He said that we as Americans, he said, we hate history. We hate history. When I heard him say that, I was like, oh, ease up, man. I teach history. Like, what are you talking about? You know, he said, we as Americans, we hate history. He said, what we love is nostalgia. We hate history. We love nostalgia. We love those stories about the past that make us feel comfortable in the present. That's why we don't want to lean into teaching about diverse histories. That's the problem with our history. We hate history, but we love nostalgia. History embraces complexity and contradiction. Nostalgia sanitizes the past for our individual comfort. History acknowledges uncomfortable truths. Nostalgia selectively remembers pleasant narratives. History versus nostalgia. History examines multiple perspectives. Nostalgia centers dominant perspectives. History seeks to understand context and consequence. Nostalgia creates simplistic golden age mythology. Anytime you hear somebody talking about we're creating a golden age, in the past or in the present, you need to get worried. Because they're leading into nostalgia over history. And rather than confront hard history, rather than wrestle with diverse histories, we tend to avoid them. And we do three things collectively to avoid teaching and talking about and learning about hard and diverse histories. The first thing that we do is we engage in purposeful historical amnesia. Purposeful historical amnesia. We pretend certain historical events and phenomena didn't happen, or we downplay their significance in the American narrative. Just a few years ago, we marked the 100th anniversary, if you will, of the Tulsa Massacre. And so many people had never heard of what happened in Tulsa, the burning and destruction of Black Wall Street. Just as they had not heard of what had happened in so many other places, Rosewood, happened in Detroit, happened in Alabama, so many other Black communities, Seneca Village in New York. Not because it wasn't recorded, just because we as a nation have collectively chosen not to remember. Purposeful historical amnesia. The other thing that we do is we tend to rationalize evil. To avoid confronting these difficult truths, we tend to rationalize evil. We dismiss actions to shield against critical examination of the choices made by historical figures. Dr. Rice was talking about sort of the founders and the institution of slavery. One of the things I've asked docents at James Madison's Montpelier, talk a little bit more about that in a second, is that what's the number one question that you are asked by visitors, typically baby boomers, when you talk to them about James Madison being in slavery, fourth president of the United States, father of the Constitution, enslaved over 100 people in the course of his lifetime, never freed a single soul. Number one question that they are asked is, but wasn't he a good master? That's attempting to rationalize evil. That's attempting to rationalize evil. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, wasn't having a romance in Paris with Sally Hemings, who was 15 years old. He was raping that poor child. But we talk about it being a romance, rationalizing evil. The third thing that we do to avoid confronting these diverse histories, to avoid confronting hard histories, we create false narratives. Now, the technical definition of creating false narratives is making shit up. And we're good at that. One of the biggest lies, one of the biggest false narratives that we have created is that of the lost cause. That affects how we teach and learn about slavery, how we teach and learn about the Civil War, how we teach and learn about Reconstruction, and how we teach and learn about Jim Crow. There's a lot of discussion about educational indoctrination. We know what educational indoctrination is because we've been force-fed educational indoctrination around the lost cause for more than a century. But we have to confront diverse and hard histories. We have to. We don't have a choice. And why don't we have a choice? You don't have to take my word for it. Take the word of James Baldwin. Anytime you get an answer to something, go read some James Baldwin. And James Baldwin answered this question by simply stating, we are our history. So that's it. Why do we have to teach and learn about diverse histories and hard histories, those difficult aspects of the past that make us feel uncomfortable in the present? Because we are our history. We're not just the good stuff, the stuff that makes us smile and laugh and sing. We're also the stuff of sorrow, of sadness, of tears, of pain. We are our history. But James Baldwin didn't leave it at that, because James Baldwin will never leave anything at that. He also said, if we pretend otherwise, we are literally criminals. If we pretend we are not our history, we are literally criminals. We are lying to ourselves. And worse, we are lying to our children. But because so many of us and so many of our kids have grown up not confronting hard histories, not learning about diverse histories, when we encounter them in the classroom, they wind up going through what I call the 5 stages of historical grief. And I know your kids will encounter and go through these stages because my kids at Ohio State are going through the same stuff. When we begin to talk about lynching, and they've never heard about it. Freshmen and sophomores in college never knew about the history of racial terrorism in America. And the 5 stages of grief, the first thing is they go through the spirit of denial. They're like, Dr. Jeffries, that never happened. Rejecting this uncomfortable historical truth. That never happened. And one of the things they say why it never happened, because if it happened, my teacher, my favorite teacher, Miss Jackson, Miss Jones, Miss Smith, would have told me about it. It couldn't have happened. The second stage, they move from denial to anger. This is the emotional response. And I will tell you, 25 years of teaching college students. Every year I get kids who are furious in this moment when presented with this information. But in all that time, I've never had a student ever get angry with me for presenting this. Talking about the founders wanting to protect the institution of slavery. Talking about white supremacists, the use of racial terrorism to beat back civil rights. You know who they get angry at? You. They get angry at their favorite teachers who withheld this information from them. They get angry at their parents, grandparents, who they feel should have shared this information with them. And because this is a personal investment, after they move through that anger, then they get to that third phase, which is bargaining. Trying to negotiate with historical reality. I get a lot of kids coming in from rural Ohio and southwest, southeast Ohio, and we'll talk about white supremacy in the state of Ohio. And then they'll come to my office hours and they're like, Dr. Jeffries, like, okay, like, I learned that my granddad was, a Klan member, and, he used to perform in blackface. But maybe he didn't know that was wrong. And my grandma, really supported this, and maybe she didn't know. And I'm like, or maybe they were just racist. I said, you can't bargain. I mean, they go through this whole negotiation thing because so much of this difficult history is tied up in our own personal identities. And why is it so hard to get students to sort of learn about this? Is because their identities are wrapped up in it. Because this history was shared to them that they believe that we're now challenging by people they love and respect and admire. And so they try to bargain. Then they move from bargaining to depression. I keep boxes of tissue in my office. These kids, after they have this realization that, man, I guess me mom was a racist, come in and they're all crying and carrying on. I'm like, look, it is what it is. This is who we are collectively, the better and the worse. But by the end of the semester, we're able to work through these 5 stages, and when we get to that 5th stage, which is critically important, which is acceptance. Coming to terms with complex historical narratives. If I can get these kids to move from denial in August to acceptance in December, then I did my job. That's what we want. Get them to understand and accept these difficult historical truths. And one of the best ways I have found, and I'll say selectively, if I'm able to get those handful of brilliant students who are trying to change the world to that moment of acceptance. And a few years ago, I said, I gotta get these kids out of the classroom. You've encountered those students who are not just good, but they're different. They're trying to do something different, and you see them, whether they're 4 years old, 14 years old, or 21 years old. So a few years ago, starting in 2018, I reached out to one of our sort of deans, and I said, listen, you guys will spend $2 million to send our students on study abroad. I said, I just need $20,000 to go to Virginia. I want to take some kids to James Madison's Montpelier. He said, all right, fine. This is the first group of students I took to James Madison's Montpelier. James Madison, like I said, is the father of the Constitution, architect of the Constitution. And I said, let's go there and study the color line, study race and democracy in America. Because of the ways in which Madison and the framers and the founders embody the fundamental contradictions at the heart of this nation. And so on October 18th, we left Columbus, Ohio, and we arrived in Virginia. The first thing we do, we arrive at night, and we sit out in the South Yard, which was where the enslaved who worked inside the Madison Mansion lived. And we had a little campfire. And it's just us, on site, surrounded by the echoes of the enslaved. And I said, we're not here just to worship and praise James Madison. We're here to understand the life and experience of everybody who lived, worked, and died here. And then the next day, of course, we start our exploration of this slave labor camp by going to the house, the mansion. particularly Madison's library, which is the room above the main door, the main entryway. And this is literally the room in which he conceives and conceptualizes the Bill of Rights. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And we often think about sort of this room, literally the room where it happened. And Madison he had one of the largest libraries, private-owned libraries in America at the time. And he's pulling these volumes from the great Greek thinkers and English philosophers. But we don't stop to say that, if he was trying to define and understand what freedom was, all he had to do was look out the door. And think about and reflect on the freedoms that he was denying the people he was holding in bondage. We talk about, sort of slavery being something not central to the lives of these framers and founders. He was a third generation enslaver. This was a family business. This is what he did. And so, of course, his interactions, his understanding of the freedoms he's denying, and he's like, all right, I know what it means to be free because I know what it means to deny people their freedom. And so as soon as we spend a little moment reflecting in his library, then I take them downstairs and outside. And I show them and have them place their hands on the bricks of this mansion. All of the bricks were made by the people who were enslaved at James Madison's plantation. Just as all the bricks at Monticello and all the bricks at Mount Vernon. And more than a few still have the handprints of the enslaved people who made those bricks. But when you put your hands on those handprints, you will notice something very odd, that your hand does not fit on theirs. Because that's not an adult hand. It's the hand of a child. Because it was the job of enslaved children to make the bricks for all of the buildings and structures on these plantations, on these slave labor camps. So our exploration of the color line begins with knowing and understanding that the room in which the Bill of Rights is conceived and conceptualized rests on a foundation of bricks made by the children Madison enslaved. That's that hard history we got to reconcile. And we have to confront. One of the powerful things that was done when they were at Montpelier, did a powerful exhibit on slavery in America and at Montpelier, is they took shards of bricks that they had been unearthing, the archaeological team, and had an artist fashion and arrange the bricks into the face of a child. And the power of that is that there are no pictures, there are no images of the children who were enslaved at Montpelier. But art brings them to life. Art restores their humanity. And that is critically important. Because too often we deny the humanity of oppressed and marginalized people. And we do just the opposite. We celebrate those who are doing the oppressing. I had a teacher, I was speaking in Virginia right before the pandemic. And I was talking about some of these very issues. And the teacher came up to me, she said, Dr. She taught fourth grade in Virginia, diverse classroom. And she said, Dr. Jeffries, I'm sorry, but I'm convinced that this generation of children are devoid of empathy. And I thought that was a sweeping generalization. I was like, but that means you're a psychopath if you have no empathy, incapable of empathy. And I said, well, that can't possibly be true. And she said, I can tell you, she said, the other day, this was in the first Trump administration, remember we were going through the chaos at the border and the arresting and the family separation, locking up kids in cages, and she was doing a lesson on that, and she wanted the kids to understand what was happening at the border, and she showed them some images. You remember the kids behind the chain link faces and the Mylar blankets. We're getting back there very soon. And she said she showed the kids the images, and there wasn't a single reaction. The kids just looked. blank face, like, what do you want us to do? 4th grade. And she said, so from that, she concluded these children lack empathy. I said, no, they don't lack empathy. And I said, I have to run and catch a plane. This lady's about to make me miss my plane. And I said, listen, this is what you do. I said, I'll tell you what to do. I can prove to you that they have empathy. But you're going to promise me that if you do this, you'll email me and tell me what happened. She said, fine. So I told her what to do. And what I told her was, next time you're in class, pull up on YouTube one of those old ASPCA commercials. Sarah McLachlan singing In the Eyes of an Angel. See, some of y'all, this is like, some of y'all may be too young to remember TV. And TV before cable, when you know, 2 o'clock in the morning, you're coming back from college, and you may be a little drunk, some of y'all doing other stuff, and you turn on TV, and nothing on but this infomercial, right? It's, you know, and they're showing, the cat with no leg, a dog with one eye. Right? It's like, if you send 2 cents, right? You can save a whole, village of cats. And it's like, oh. And you feel bad. I said, show them one of those commercials and see what happens. And sure enough, the next week I get an email from her, and she says, oh my goodness. I put on the commercial, within 15 seconds, she said there were children crying, like, what's going on? Who could do this? Why would everybody treat animals so badly? And she was perplexed. She was like, I don't understand. I said, because they have empathy. They have more empathy for dogs and cats than they do for children of color. Why? Because they've been conditioned. We condition our children to have empathy for animals. We talk to them all the time. Treat this dog kindly. Speak. Look how beautiful this little. We don't say that about little black and brown children. And that's part of a pattern that we do with our history. So we create empathy for our oppressors in the past. Celebrating presidents on President's Day. The wonderful things of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. We do that for years, and then finally our children get to 8th grade or 7th grade and they learn a little American history that they were enslaved. They're like, well, hell, it couldn't have been that bad because this guy used to cut down cherry trees. We're generating empathy for oppressors and apathy for the oppressed. This is why when we're teaching these difficult histories, these hard histories, diverse histories, we have to generate empathy for the humanity for the marginalized. Otherwise, they will never have empathy for them. That's critically important. But when we do that, when we take our kids beyond the 4 walls of the classroom, when we lean into hard history and diverse histories, they move to a 6th stage in response. So we have the 5 stages, and they get to acceptance. And acceptance is where I want most of my kids to be at the end of the semester. Like legally, I just need them to get to acceptance. But the 6th stage is where I really want them to be. The 6th stage is what I see, is what happens when we teach this history honestly, when we teach this history in a way that incorporates and includes and does not exclude and does not minimize and marginalize. The 6th stage is action. Action. When we teach this history, we get students to move beyond, on their own, beyond acceptance, and moving towards engagement and advocacy. That's what happens. You say, well, is that just what happens in your class, Dr. Jeffries? That may be something that you just have going on. No. We've seen that in real time. May 25, 2020 is when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And in June and July, the summer of 2020, we all lived through it. The largest protests in American history, led overwhelmingly by young people. 20 to 30 million people taken to the streets just in America in June, and another 20 to 30 million in July. Action. And these kids were not just demanding. How do we know this was connected to them learning stuff? Because they weren't just demanding justice for the victims of police violence. They weren't just demanding that black folk and black lives Black people have their humanity recognized. That's why they have the beautiful murals, so many painted across the American landscape. But they were also demanding what? An honest accounting of history. Tear down those statues of Confederates. Rename those streets, rename those buildings. They were telling us we were learning something. The work that we were doing as teachers was sinking in. And they were demanding that we do better. Largest protest in America, we don't even talk about it anymore. March on Washington had 250,000 people. But one Sunday in the summer of '63. We're talking about tens of millions. We act as though it didn't happen. But it's critically important for understanding the moment that we find ourselves in now. Because Newton's third law of social movement motion is that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So it's not surprising that in the summer of 2020, that the following year, starting in 2021, we saw a wave of voter suppression laws. 400 plus restrictive laws passed, initiated, introduced, many of which were passed over the last 5 years to silence student protests. And going right along with that, the equal and opposite reaction was a wave of educational indoctrination laws, sweeping the nation. Begins with anti-CRT, critical race theory. Starting in the spring of 2021, I started getting these calls from journalists saying, hey, could you tell us about critical race theory? I'm like, why do I want to know about that now? I didn't realize that this is what they were doing. And this was critical. This is why educators have come under assault. Because one of the things that those young people were demanding in the summer of 2020 was that change happened, an end to systemic racism. You had little white kids, little Kylie, going back to the suburbs, talking about, Mom, we got to end systemic racism. And that shook people up. And there's only two things that you can do when that's the demand. It's either do something or do nothing. And if you choose to do nothing, meaning preserve the status quo, then you have to provide a justification for it. And the justification for doing nothing was that we don't have to listen to these kids because they've all been indoctrinated. They've been indoctrinated with this thing called critical race theory. So therefore, we don't have to teach African American studies, because that's, again, educational indoctrination. Everything becomes anti-CRT, anti-African American studies, anti-LGBTQ+. And then, of course, right now we're dealing with anti-diversity, equity, inclusion, everything. I've never seen a political party. This is just an historical analysis. This is a personal opinion. Be anti-everything. How are you anti-everything? What do you stand for? So, if this is the context, if we know that students respond to this history, but we also know the pushback that we feel in the moment, how do we teach this? What do we do? And I think our charge as educators is to teach the history accurately and also effectively. So if we're going to teach it accurately, teach these diverse histories, teach these hard histories accurately, there's a couple things that we all should be doing. Across the curriculum and from kindergarten through college. So vertically and horizontally. The first thing is we have to teach facts, not fiction, which can be a challenge in this environment where education and politics are now being treated like religion. Nope, we're going to deal with facts, and one of the ways you deal with that is you lean into primary sources. You don't have to take my word for it. I say that all the time. Read the source. I invite kids. Most of my students at Ohio State, I went to Myles College, historical black college, with my wife. Graduated from Spelman College, another historical black college. And sometimes I go home and I talk about school, and she's still thinking I'm teaching like all black kids. I'm like, no, 90% of my students are white. I get a lot of kids, the majority of white students have never had an African American, not just professor, not just teacher. They've never had an African American, a person of color, in a position of authority. So they walk into the classroom, and I understand that. There's stuff I can't say on day one, because I don't have any credibility with that. So I have to let the sources speak. And once they see the sources, then they're like, wait, this guy knows what he's talking about. Facts, not fiction. The second thing we have to do is we have to teach critical thinking. Can't walk away from that, especially because so much of the information that our students are receiving is coming unfiltered through various media, particularly online and TikToks and all these other things. They have to be able to analyze. They have to be able to read. They have to be able to ask the question of what are the sources. So if we want to teach this history accurately, we have to teach this critical thinking to interrogate sources. We have to center everyday people. Everyday people. Take everyday people seriously as political thinkers, and one of the ways to do that is to engage in oral histories. Talk to people. Not just those who we assume are making history, but the everyday people who often make history. We have to animate our teaching, movies and documentaries, incorporate those. In 2010, 2011, I stopped teaching the African American History Survey with a textbook. I began teaching a course called African American History through film. I realized once we had the ability to stream films and documentaries, I realized, I'm like, damn, it's easier for me to get a kid to watch 4 hours of a documentary on Netflix than to read for 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. Fine, I will take it. And so that's what I do. A whole class in which we watch documentary films as their assignments. They might watch 8, 10, 12 hours of films a week, of documentaries a week, and then we come in and we critically interrogate a movie. And they begin to see the patterns. That's the language that they speak. That's the language that they speak, and so we need to figure out how to incorporate that into our classroom instruction. We need to enliven our teaching with music and material culture. Make it happen. Let them feel history, not just read and hear about history. And then lastly, we have to make our teaching meaningful. We need to connect it to the present. This is also one of the things that people are pushing back on. The whole purpose for understanding the past is to make sense of the present. And also to prepare our children for the future. To give them the tools that they need to make better decisions than we have made in the present and in the past. So these are some of the elements that we need to teach history accurately. But it doesn't do us any good if we're accurate in our instruction, but we're ineffective in our delivery. So what do we need to do to teach diverse histories effectively? The first thing is we have to be intentional. We can't run away from hard history. We can't run away from race, in particular, in this instance. We got to set it up. Students, teachers will come and say, well, Dr. Jeffries, I have this really amazing lecture on slavery that it's February and I was looking forward to it. And the students are looking at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, well, have you ever talked about black people yet? This is February. It's like, no, this is the first time. Well, you're not being intentional about it. You got to build it up. Weave it in from start to finish. Being intentional. Don't run from it. Be unafraid. So much of what we're being told we can't do in the classroom is because it makes students uncomfortable. And by students, we're really talking about like that. Right? There's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable. There is a difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe. They're pretending as though being uncomfortable is being unsafe. No. Being uncomfortable is where the learning happens. So the best, most powerful learning happens when you're uncomfortable, when you're moving in your seat like, oh my goodness, why am I thinking this? What does this mean? We want to lean into that. Can't be afraid of that. We have to understand our classroom, of course. We got to know which students to protect and which students to correct, but we lean into it. Third thing we have to do to be effective is we have to be open. Be open with our students. One of the things I've encountered is particularly among white teachers, is that they're like, okay, we're going to talk about race, and they're all into talking about having these critical conversations about race and racism, and never have actually self-identified to their class. Have never actually stood before their classroom and said, I am white. What does that mean? So you want them to have a conversation that you won't even have. So we have to be open with our students. And not just about sort of our racial identity. We have to be open about what we have learned and what we had to relearn. What we had to unlearn. We weren't always as knowledgeable and brilliant as we are now in front of them, we thought some stupid stuff. I was a 8-year-old kid in Brooklyn, New York. In Brooklyn, New York, all black neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. My favorite show was The Dukes of Hazzard. I'm running around the house, jumping on cars, sliding off the hood. Just ignorant as hell. Talking about just a good old boy. When we share what we used to think and what we think now, we're giving our students permission to be wrong. We're giving our students permission to unlearn. And we're telling them that you're on a journey that I have been on, and I'm going to continue to be on this journey with you. So if you want them to evolve, you want them to learn, you want them to be open, we have to be open ourselves. We also have to be aware. You have to start where your students are. Not to be dismissive. They're coming in with all this either not knowing or knowing some nonsense. And every couple of years I have to reset with my students. Because I got to figure out where are they, what are they thinking? Are they with me? Are they to the right of me? Are they to the left of me? Are they ahead of me? Are they behind me? You got to know. You got to be smart in this moment, teaching in universals. You know, a couple of years ago, you could talk, hey, I'm talking about democracy. I'm talking about freedom. I mean, it's almost like now that's on the banned list. But there are universals that we need to talk about. So depending upon where you are and how much space you have, you can always lean into that. I'm never going to give up talking about democracy and freedom and liberty. If the founders can talk about it, I can talk about it. We want to be proactive in this moment, reaching out to parents, reaching out to communities, letting them know what we're doing. We're not making a hide in the classroom. We're not the ones making stuff up. So we invite them in. This is what we're doing. Because at the moment, depending on where you are, when you get that one outsider, one parent, perhaps a community person, that says, this person is teaching nonsense or Marxism, this, that, and the other, you don't have to say anything. You'll have parents who be like, that's not true. They'll be the best blockers for you, the best advocates. They can't do it if they don't know what you're doing. And then lastly, this is the time to be bold. This is not the time to be shrinking away and saying, well, maybe I can just hold off. No, this is the time to double down on the things that we have been doing. This is not the time to walk away. We need you to continue to do the things you've been doing now more than ever. Now more than ever. And what happens when we do this? What happens in this moment when we do these things? I wasn't quite sure. The last couple of years teaching, the students, I wasn't connecting with the students the ways I had in years past. One of the classes I teach is on the civil rights movement. It's a staple class. I've been teaching it every year at Ohio State for the last 20 years. And the last 2 years, post-COVID, you know, the kids, they're just looking at me. Like I have these wonderful assignments and the multimedia, this, that, and the other, and I'm barely getting anything from them. And so the beginning of this past school year, or this past, in the spring semester, January, I said, you know what, my civil rights class, I'm just redesigning. And I had all these sort of democratic principles of engagement and conversation. So I'm doing away with all that. I'm just gonna lecture. And y'all just gonna listen. Because I gotta figure out how to connect, and until I can figure that out, I'm gonna make sure that you're hearing what I'm saying, no more guessing. And so in a class of 60 students, 65 students, I said, y'all just have to learn to take notes and listen. And so we were about two months into the semester. February 27th, 2025. And the students had an exam. Their first exam was essentially a midterm exam. And I had to be in Washington, D.C. And so I had left town. I had my TA, God bless the TAs, had my TA give the exam. And while I was in D.C., I started receiving these emails and text messages. And they were from students and colleagues. And they were saying that the president of the university had called a meeting to declare that he was sunsetting, that he was ending all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at The Ohio State University. Ending. 60 years of programs done away within 4 weeks of the new Trump administration. Not because it was mandated, because he felt it was on the horizon. And my colleagues were texting me, and my students were emailing me. These were students who were at this meeting, and near a single one of them looked excited or happy. And that was the same attitude of my students. The first student who emailed me was a young white girl from up in Northeast Ohio, Addison. She was a freshman. I don't get many freshmen in my senior, upper level classes. And Addison was already demonstrated that she was a serious student. And Addison emailed me and she said, Dr. Jeffries, I don't know if you heard what the president has done, but he's done it. And next week, on March 4th, this was a Thursday, our class meets Tuesday and Thursday. Said March 4th, there's going to be a rally. And I want to know if I can attend the rally. And she was asking because our class meets at 12:45 and the rally was to begin at 1 o'clock. And I didn't email her immediately. I was trying to figure out what was going on. So in fact, I didn't get her back until Sunday. And in that interim, I got another 20 emails. A third of the class had emailed me. They got, Jeffrey, you want to attend this rally? I was still getting to know this class. Remember, I had just been lecturing to them. Y'all just sit here and listen. And so I emailed Addison back. I said, Addison, meet me in my office on Monday, and we can discuss. And Addison came in on Monday, and she was a little nervous. I was like, Addison, what's wrong? She said, well, Dr. Jeffries, I emailed you on Thursday. Can I attend the rally? I didn't hear anything back from you. And then Sunday, you said, come to my office. I was like, oh, my bad. I didn't make you nervous, right? I said, I just had a question to ask you. How many the kids get nervous? And I said, listen, there's now, since the this is all under this president, this administration, since the student protests in response to the war in Gaza in the spring, there's now new rules governing what professors can say in the classroom, what we can do in the classroom. One of the new rules is we can't encourage students to attend the protest. Now, this is a civil rights class. On Tuesday, March 4th, the lecture was going to be on the Selma to Montgomery protest and campaign. So now I got a decision to make. And I said, Addison, this is what I want you to do. I said, in class, when class begins, I want you to share with the class why you think this protest is important and why you want to know. And then I want you to invite your class members to go with you. And if somebody goes with you, then you have to go. Now, I already knew that 20 students wanted to go. So I knew that where the class was in that sense. And so she said, well, actually, exact quote was, Dr. Jeffries, I just came in here to ask if I could attend the rally. I wasn't trying to lead the rally. And I said, well, you got to channel your inner elevator. Yeah, that's what we do. And so she said, okay, she would do that. We talked a little bit about what she might say, and then she headed off. Tuesday came. And class was full. All 65 students were there. Kids came in. And I said, listen, I know there's a rally. It's about to start soon. I said, I've asked her classmate Addison to say a few words. Addison came up to the front, looked a little nervous. She had some notes. She opened them up. And then she started talking. Talking from her notes, talking from her heart. Talking about why it was important for them to be a part of this protest. Why it was important to maintain these programs. And then she said, and I'm standing off on the side, kids that wrapped the tent, I'm standing off to the side. Then she said, a couple weeks ago, Dr. Jeffries talked about the Cold War and the importance of the external pressure that was being brought to bear on the U.S. government in the 1950s and early 1960s. And talking about how that was important to create space for activists to generate the internal pressure that was ultimately needed to move the federal government to action. And she paused and she said, "We are the internal pressure here at Ohio State." I said, "Well, goddamn." Go ahead, Addison. And she said a few more words and she said, "I invite you to join me out on the Oval." And then she took a seat. Students, her classmates, rose and gave her a standing ovation. I was like, I've been lecturing for 2 months. I never get a standing ovation. I told the kids, I said, "Listen, Addison has made an invitation to you." I'll wrap this up, now you're done. Addison has made an invitation to you. I can't tell you to go. I'm not going to tell you to go. I'm also not going to tell you to stay. This is what I'm going to do. Today, I'm going to record this lecture. And I put my computer in the back. I set it up on Zoom. I said, "I'm going to record this lecture. So anybody who is not here, you will not miss a thing. Because I'm going to record this and post this lecture at 2 o'clock when class is over. So you may do what you want." Every single student in the class stood up, took their bags, and walked out the door. For the next hour and 10 minutes, I gave the best lecture at the Ohio State University on the freedom struggle in Selma, Alabama, to a completely empty class. And when it was over, and I uploaded it, look, if they're gonna come after me, I can make it easy, right? I said, "Now let me see what's going on the Oval." I never told them I was gonna head out to the Oval myself, but I did. And when I went out there were over 1,000 people, mostly students, but also faculty and staff. And as I began to work my way through the crowd, I began to see some of my students, past but also present, in that class. And I began to work my way up to the statue in the Oval, and that's where the speakers were assembling. Because the other thing that I didn't tell them, it was that I was also planning to speak at the rally. I am afraid of these sons of bitches. They need to hear some truth.
Woo!
They need to hear some truth.
Preach.
People say, you at this rally, you're talking about the president, and, was he a coward or complicit or incompetent, and concluding that he was all three? That are you afraid of losing your job? I'm more afraid of losing my soul. For not speaking truth in this moment. And right when I was about to speak, I saw 4 students of mine from that class. And they saw me, and so they get excited because they realize I'm about to speak. And right when I'm about to step up onto the podium, they start singing. These 4 students, they start singing, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." And they start adding the words, "Ain't gonna let President Carter turn me around. Ain't gonna let President Trump turn me around. Ain't gonna let ICE turn me around." They were singing a freedom song that we had just learned in class 2 weeks ago. And as they began to sing, it begins to ripple through the crowd. The entire crowd begins to sing. Then I gotta sing. I'm like, damn, I gotta sing. No, I'm like, no, I feel this, right? I feel this. And so after I finished, they gave us 3 minutes to speak. And just like now, 12 minutes later, when I was done, I made a beeline straight to those 4 students of mine in the class. And I said, and Gabe in particular, Gabe was a Latin brother and transferred from one of the community colleges. And he was leading them in the song. And I said, "Gabe," I said, "Man, I didn't have you singing a freedom song out here." And he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Dr. Jeffries," he said, "you taught us that before snake activists would speak, would have a mass meeting, would have a rally, would have a meeting, they would always sing freedom songs to boost their spirits, to energize them, to strengthen them, to fortify them. Well, we decided that you needed your freedom song. We decided you needed your freedom song. The students are telling us that we have to fight. Not for ourselves, not for our job, that we have to fight for that. We have to fight to teach them the truth. We have to fight to teach them this history, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard, even when it hurts our soul. Because that's what they need to know. When they know it, they act on it. That's what we need them to do. We need them to make this democracy, the one that was promised but never realized to be true. And we can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. And thank you again for sharing your brilliance, genius, knowledge, and experience with everybody here from the state of Michigan and across the country. Can we give it up one more time? So my name is Jeffrey Austin. I'm a literacy consultant at Wayne Research. I've had the honor and privilege of being one of the co-planners of this event for really the past 9 or 10 months that we've been working in earnest on it. And I had the privilege of talking with Dr. Jeffrey today and following up with some of the themes and ideas in your keynote and getting your perspective on some stuff. Thank you to everybody who contributed ideas and themes and things that they wanted to hear about. We appreciate that. We're going to try to get to as much as we possibly can.
Let's go.
Are you ready?
Let's go.
All right. Good. I like it. So I want to kind of go back to where we started today with Beth and her introduction. When we were planning this summit, thinking a lot about it, we felt like we collectively needed to learn, amplify, and uplift untold stories and people's histories, especially those that are local and around us, and that we needed to grow the pedagogies and practices to teach those responsibly and respectfully and responsibly and relevantly. So in our planning, we were guided by the question that Beth asked from Dr. Elizabeth Moji. What might it mean to fuse the moral and intellectual to teach in socially just ways that produce social justice? I'm wondering what your thoughts on that might be. What does it look like to teach inclusive, diverse, and comprehensive histories in ways that are socially just and that produce social justice?
Yeah, no, I think that's the important question, because I think it's the right question. And I don't think there's one set answer. I think there are answers to that question. What does it mean to do that depends upon the community that you're in. Depends upon the students that you have in your classroom. It depends upon the local history. It depends on what the challenges are that people are facing in that community. The challenges that students are facing in that community. So I think the answer to that is very local. And you have to understand, when I was mentioning before that you have to know your classroom. To know your classroom, you gotta know the kids, who to protect, who to correct, but you also have to know their parents. You gotta know the community. You gotta know sort of what is the vibe outside. What's the history outside? Because they're bringing that into the community. I think centering the voices of people who have been historically marginalized in that community and more broadly is critically important. It just can't be the history of the same old folk. telling the same old stories. Because our students will tell us, and they've been telling us, that that's not enough, that's insufficient. And they get, you know intuitively when the student is looking at you like, man, this person's bullshitting me, right? And sometimes they won't say it depending upon who you are as the teacher, the instructor. But the kids are shut down. Black kids have been doing this in the classroom for years. Well, I don't know why these kids won't engage with this subject. It's really powerful. They've turned it off. They don't believe what you're saying. Either the way you say it or how you're framing it, or because you didn't talk about it before. And so, the social justice outcome, the justice outcome, begins in the classroom with how we manage our classroom. Hopefully, democratically small d. Ideally, sometimes, like I did this brother, like, look, y'all just gotta listen to me. I got something to say, y'all gotta hear it, I need y'all to hear this. And then build from there. But I think in the end, it's all about the local, right? And we just have to be attuned to it so that we can make the right decisions about what history to talk about, what local stories to talk about, because that will connect with the students.
Yeah, that's really amazing. There's some couple questions for you, really about that too, about place-based learning and the importance of that. I mean, you did a great job talking about your place-based learning experiences with your students, and I, you know, that's been really, I think, at the heart of some of our planning for this summit also. So I want to ask that, you know, as fundamental as it is to your practice, one of the concepts that really fascinated our planning team and about place-based learning is this idea of a palimpsest, right? That you can never really erase what happened before. There's always the marks that are left there from what transpired in history, especially if you know what you're looking at. I think that can be important. And I'm thinking about a quote from Karen Barad, who says, "Memories and rememberings are written into the flesh of the world." So I want to ask you about your trips and your experience with place-based learning. What role can place-based learning play in resisting erasure, nostalgia, imagined pasts, and contribute to that effort of teaching diverse histories responsibly and responsibly?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that excited me about these two days was the place-based experience. It's not just that I've been doing that with students, trying to get them out into the real world beyond the classroom, but I also do it with teachers. I got some grant money that they haven't taken away yet, and as long as they don't take it away, I'll keep it and spending it to teach what I call difficult subjects. And we have 3 cohorts, been doing it for the last 5 years, of teachers, Central Ohio teachers, K through 12. And we do one on American slavery, we do one on climate justice. The other one, the third one, we've been doing it on immigration and all the subjects that we ain't supposed to be teaching. And now we're going to introduce a 4th one on civil rights. And in each of those, place is critically important to the learning. So we focus both on content, but then also on pedagogy. And we take the teachers that they're with us for a semester on their own, they'll give a little stipend, but on Saturdays, you know, we get together, usually virtually, but there's always some field experience. And so for the teachers, I've been teaching the one on American slavery. We, at the end of our time together in June, I've been taking them up to Akron, Ohio. And you're like, all right, what's in Akron, Ohio, right? Akron, Ohio was where John Brown lived. John Brown also has a Michigan connection, a Detroit connection right here. John Brown, the abolitionist, spent most of his life in Akron, Ohio. And his home in Akron, Ohio has now been preserved and restored by the Akron County, the Summit County Historical Society. They've done a wonderful job of interrogating sort of that history. And so here's the history of abolition. We talked about, I mentioned before about the Underground Railroad. The kids are like, oh yeah, the Underground Railroad, we'd all been conductors. Would you have been John Brown? Would you have been John Brown? Because thinking about some of the history and the memory, it's not just, think about the ways in which we torture John Brown's memory in history. Here is someone who we teach as sort of a raving lunatic. And he was crazy. Just think about the classic portraits, right? John Brown, the fire in his eyes. If you dismiss the person as crazy, then you can dismiss what they've done as crazy. And the people who admire them as crazy. You don't have to take them seriously. John Brown wasn't a raving lunatic. John Brown was committed to equality, to racial equality in ways that other white folk of that generation just simply weren't. We love to talk about Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, who didn't even emancipate anybody with the Emancipation Proclamation. They're like, oh, he believed in racial egalitarianism. They know he didn't. He believed in white supremacy. You could be an abolitionist and a white supremacist. Most of them were. That's what was pissing off Frederick Douglass all the time. They were like, no, but Abraham Lincoln, he had, Frederick Douglass. He had a close relationship with Frederick Douglass. That was his one black friend. And he didn't even listen to him. He was like, make this a war for freedom. And he's like, no, this is a war to preserve the Union. John Brown was different. Frederick Douglass writes about John Brown going to visit him in that house. And John Brown requiring that Frederick Douglass sit at the head of the house, that he eat before him, his wife, and his children. That was John Brown. The John Brown who not only was willing to give his life to end slavery, but he was willing to sacrifice the life of his children. 2 of his sons died at Harper's Ferry. That's a kind of commitment that we erase. But we haven't always erased it. So Du Bois is writing about John Brown in Akron, Ohio. There's a memorial that was built to John Brown at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, by white working class laborers who were like, this is the hero that we need to uphold. And that monument was expanded in the 1930s by African Americans who came up to Akron during the Great Migration. And so having that, taking the teachers up there to say, listen, we want to talk about abolition, we want to talk about the Civil War, we want to talk about Reconstruction, talk about the Underground Railroad, we need to talk about John Brown. Because in the end, John Brown we dismissed because John Brown used violence. John Brown was right. The only way that slavery was going to end was through violence, was through taking up arms. And he was right. That's what it took. So why are we teaching that? Why are we talking about that? So taking him up there to sort of recover that history and say, okay, what are the challenges here? And what can we do with John Brown is important. But then also, in Akron, like, I'm not going to front. I thought Akron was Goodyear and LeBron. But Akron has a lot going on. Because Akron, Ohio, with another Michigan connection, Akron, Ohio is also the place where Sojourner Truth gave a famous on our Women's speech in 1853. And most recently, they built a statue and plaza to Sojourner Truth, a stone's throw away from the site, which is no longer there, where she gave that speech. And so, in this instance, you can't go to the place and see what was once there. It's a grassy lot now. But because people have been inspired by that history, they've built up, in today's moment, something to commemorate her that sparks this conversation and discussion. And of course, Sojourner Truth will eventually settle in Michigan, in Battle Creek, Michigan, buried here with another beautiful statue, larger than life. And I've never visited the one up in Battle Creek, but I want to, because one of her quotes that has always inspired me is inscribed on the wall behind it. And it talks about Sojourner Truth talking about truth. And her saying that, her prayer is that, when her day finally comes, that she'll be able to say to the Lord that she spoke the truth. And she did everything that she could and gave it all that she had to speak the truth. And if that's what we can say at the end, then we've done right.
So, I want to take what you're talking about right now and turn our attention, about teaching. Why aren't we teaching this way, or why aren't we teaching these stories? One of the guiding quotes for the call for proposals for this summit was from an American artist, Len Ligon, who's maybe one of the great American artists artists in the world. And he said that a lot of his work is about making room for history with a small h. And you've talked about that in your presentation, we've talked about that up here. And I think that's kind of how we envision this event, right? Making room for that people's history. So, we've got a room full of educators here, right? How do you suggest and see them making room in their classrooms, curriculum, and campuses for teaching that sort of small H history? And by extension, what can school leaders, curriculum directors, administrators, county level, consultants, state level folks do to support teachers? Because it can't be all on teachers, right? It's got to be a collective.
Yeah, no. Working backwards, it absolutely has to be a collective effort. No matter what happens outside, we have a charge, we have a mission as teachers, as educators in the classroom to teach truth, to teach history the way it happened. And so no matter what's going to happen, we have to do that. It could be made a lot easier for us as teachers in the classroom if we had that administrative support. But we can't necessarily guarantee that that's going to happen, especially if you have that administrative support, fantastic, God bless you, you better use it, because there's a lot of teachers who don't have it. And so those who do have to model what we should be doing, so those who don't can point to them and say, look, this is the way we're teaching this history, this is the content, this is the pedagogy, these are the things that we need to be doing. So having that administrative support is critically important, but just because you don't have it doesn't mean that you need to give up, right? You need to push those. And the thing I've learned about administrators, right? A vice principal, their aspiration in life apparently is to become a principal. A principal's aspiration in life is to become an assistant superintendent. Assistant superintendent, no offense to assistant superintendent, to become a superintendent, right? But that's different than us who are in the classroom. Like Ohio State is trying to make me a dean. I don't want to be a dean. I want to be with the people, with the kids. That's why we've chosen this. That's why we're here. So God bless them if we have them. But if you don't, you can't use it as an excuse. You got to figure out a way to work anyway, to teach these histories, plural, with the small h. And what does that look like? What does that mean? For me, I'm a historian. I'm a social historian. I mean, history begins with people. So you want to teach one of the ways one of the ways we get around teaching diverse histories and difficult subjects is like, oh, we're talking about systems, right? We're talking about slavery as an economic system. It was an economic system. It was an economic system based on the exploitation of people by people who were exploiting them. So how are you going to talk about the institution of slavery without talking about people? People who were enslaved and people who were enslavers. That's the small h that we need to talk about. So even the big name people who are like, oh, I'm moving away from talking about George Washington. No, we need to talk about George Washington. But not with the big H, with the small h. The rationalization of somebody like George Washington. Okay, and I'm not just saying this here, in the comfort of people who agree. 2 weeks ago, I was out Mount Vernon, lecturing on the legacy of George Washington. And I was like, one of the things that we do with George Washington and these big H people is we do that rationalization. And George Washington, he may have enslaved, not even they would say enslaved, he may have held, right? He was enslaved, actively enslaving people, 300 people, but in his will, he said that they were emancipated or would have their freedom once Martha died. And they said, and folks were like, well, why didn't he emancipate him when he died? If he wasn't going to emancipate him before. Because he could have emancipated him before. They're like, no. He inherited those folks from Martha, so he didn't have the power to emancipate them. And I'm like, are we talking about the same George Washington who just led a revolution against the King of England? And so now he's a feminist? No, you're trying to rationalize this away. He didn't want to do it. Period. And left it up to Martha. And now Martha's looking at 300 people like, we can't wait for you to die. And so she does the emancipation for her whole life. But so we can take the big figures and bring them back down to earth. ordinary folk in the past. This is why those stories, like when we hear the material culture becomes so critically important, because we don't always have their words, but we have the shards of brick that they made. Not just to touch history or tell history, but to feel history. And so bringing in the field, bringing in the community, there's ways to make history be seen and encountered by everybody.
So I want to talk about that. What you're kind of alluding to with preservation and bringing these stories in, because we may not have everything that we might want or need to do. And you did an amazing job of talking about, erasure, nostalgia. So I was hoping to ask you a question about archives as a historian, a social historian.
Only historians get excited about archives.
So I think, as a planning group and as people thinking about this summit, I think, we were kind of thinking about the next 2 days as an archive, right? We're archiving these untold stories and, thinking about what we can learn from them and take from them and how we can teach them. But I'm wondering from your perspective, what we can learn from sort of groups that have been marginalized about archiving and protecting history. And I'm wondering how might our schools and classrooms and districts take up some of that archival work in our local communities? Because I think, as we know, right, a lot of the great archives in history are basements, closets, floorboards, right? Things that have been found in really unexpected places that have, I think, helped us do the work that we're talking about here. So, what does it mean for a classroom and students to kind of be archivists?
Yeah, no, I love the way you expanded the definition of what an archive is. I mean, traditionally, we think about an archive as alabaster stone sort of building and stake, and your formal people who are collecting stuff. We also know that marginalized communities have often been excluded from traditional archives. And archives have been doing better work. Mississippi Department of Archives and History, for example, has done wonderful work in expanding the history of African American civil rights. But ultimately, you are right. Archives are produced on an ongoing basis by people in communities. I mean, my dad, who just passed away a year and a half ago, some would call him a pack rat. I would call him a dedicated archivist, right? Not just to family history, but to the experiences that he had growing up in the Jim Crow North, in politics and community organizing, as a social worker, who was a substance abuse counselor for 25 years, through the height of the heroin and crack epidemics. I mean, going through the stuff that he had, notes and materials that he had collected over the years, that is an archive. And how do we access that? It shouldn't just be, what are the ways to access that? I think is not just, through, adults who are going through that phase of life where parents are transitioning and suddenly you're discovering for the first time some amazing things that they did. It's by having our students engage in this history, right? To interview parents, to interview community members, to interview grandparents, to ask them. And what you'll get as somebody who does oral history, with everyday people, who I know, and looking back to civil rights, for example, even here in Detroit, the book in Alabama. And one of the things I learned about Detroit was like, the area from Detroit is the Alabama connection, right? That is just Alabama North. And is that they would say, well, I didn't do anything in the movement, right? Like I wasn't a civil rights activist, right? They'll dismiss what they actually did. And it's like, I'm not worried about the label. And then you start talking to them, and you see all the things that they did. All the heroic, amazing things that were never recorded by anybody else. And so the oral history is an archive, right? And collecting that and preserving that and just having conversation, talking to the community, especially when so many of our neighborhoods are in transition now, which means buildings, the physical structures are being often destroyed, changed, and people are being pushed out. And so we got to preserve that. But it's the good and the bad. It's a project I've been working on for the last couple of years out of Connecticut. And and one of the leaders of that project, it's about empowering students and students in the local history. And discovering, sort of uncovering our histories, broadly defined. And he said, and this is Instructor, he said, we're not training students to study history. He said, we're training student historians. And that means engaging in archives. That means building archives. That means helping people add to their own archives. And they're in Connecticut, working with Yale University to say, you have to do better to make sure you incorporate the stories of everyday, ordinary people and make it accessible. Right? An archive has to be accessible as well. You don't do anybody any good if you're collecting stuff and just hoarding it, right? It's meant to preserve, but then also to share.
I'd probably be remiss if I didn't ask you about Lowndes County, being that you have written a book on the subject, and there's a lot going on there even currently, and I think I want to turn our attention there a little bit. About 3 months ago, we know that the Department of Justice halted their investigation into Lowndes County's water infrastructure, which has created a public health and ecological disaster. And certainly here in Michigan, we've had our own issues with water infrastructure and the public health and social health outcomes of that have been really negative. So I think I want to bring together these threads about abolition, diverse histories, but also what you were talking about earlier about ecological justice and climate justice, which I guess may in fact be another hard history. And I want to think about the poet Ed Roberson from Pittsburgh. He said, our work is not just about saving the earth, but seeing the earth before the end. So I'm wondering from you, what can we learn from marginalized people, but also, maybe Black and Indigenous thinkers and activists and everyday people in particular, about how to honor the earth as we walk on it?
That's great. So a little preview for those who are going to be in the session a little bit later on. Freedom Dreaming, doing with Jamal Easley, should be here somewhere. One of the things I'm going to talk about, one of the points I want to make there, during our time together this afternoon, is that we have to take everyday people seriously as political thinkers. Because we don't do that. And we haven't. So we don't take enslaved people seriously as political thinkers. We don't take free people seriously as political thinkers. We don't take poor, working class, laboring folks seriously as political thinkers. We think they're just moving through the world. No, they understand what's going on. They understand the nature of their problems. They understand the issues that they're facing. And they're making decisions based upon that understanding. And so one of the things that we do, because we don't take folks seriously as political thinkers, marginalized everyday people seriously as political thinkers, we just assume that their interests are this because we see them organizing around something. So, they're only interested in voting, right? Because that's the only thing we see. No, they're making a strategic decision that this is where there's a chance and opportunity to create some change, so we're going to focus our energy here. Well, they've always been interested in land ownership. They've always been interested in land use. They've always been interested in housing and access to housing, whether we're talking about in rural communities or affordable housing in urban communities. And so there's a broad spectrum of civil rights and human rights, that I call freedom rights, that Black folk and marginalized folk have always been fighting for. And so these things are not discrete, right? Environmental crises are connected to civil rights issues, are connected to labor issues, are connected to political issues. And folk on the ground have always seen that thread. And so, yes, there are times where you have to focus on one issue because there might be some gain or it's more extreme, or because other avenues are cut off. Like we have to, especially in this moment, we're going to be thinking about that now. Like, all right, if we can't focus our energy here, right, because there's too much resistance, then we got these other issues that we need to focus on and have to try to focus on. And so the environment, the earth, the land has always been central to the experience of Black folk coming up out of the South. And we think of Black folk in the 21st century as being an urban-centered people, but we all got roots in the South. Right? I learned that critically when I came up to interview people from Lowndes County. I interviewed a sister from Lowndes County who had been living in Detroit for 50 years. And she's like, well, they were living in an apartment. And I'm in an apartment, she's like, we need to go outside to the garden. And I was like, all right, we go out to the garden, and she was like, it's corn. And I'm like, we're in the middle of Detroit, and this is like 1997, so she had a whole lot about to herself, right? And she was like, no, this is Alabama, this is the earth, this is the earth, this is the land, this is who I am. And I think some of that has been lost. But in this moment in time where we're seeing resources being consumed at such extraordinary rates, data centers and the like, that we need to get back to saying, hold on. That we can only go as far as the land will let us. And I think that's an understanding that people here have had for a long time. So we can learn not just about the past, but we can learn from the people of the past that will serve us well in the present.
Reminds me of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's quote, where life is precious, life is precious.
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries, for agreeing to stay on for an extra half hour. Before we get you on your way to the first breakout session, we want to take a moment and recognize the amazing community partners that have been set up outside here today. These are people that can work with you and are willing to collaborate with you to make the teaching of inclusive, diverse, and comprehensive histories more possible. They have amazing resources, often free, to help you out and do that work. We know it is hard work. Also, we want to shout out the Source Booksellers, a local cultural institution. We're grateful for them. They're set up outside with some books. Check them out. So thank you to all of you community organizations for being here and for supporting this work. We're just so grateful to you. Can we give our community organizations a round of applause? Also, really quickly, I want to shout out the guys upstairs who've been running this whole thing for us. Premier AV, James is the tech lead back there. James and his crew were here late last night, so can we give them a round of applause? Another person that we want to thank is a local artist, Wally Johnson. You've seen the image behind Wally on all the slides and throughout this entire venue, and you'll continue to see it because you and everybody here, I feel like I'm giving stuff away now, which I am. Everybody here is going to get a copy of Wally Johnson's print that Dr. Rice got earlier. So when you pick up your stuff at the end of the day, you're going to get an 11 by 14 in your classroom. You're going to get also a model lesson plan that comes with that, which you're free to do what you will with. But we wanted to also provide you with resources to talk about place project-based history and learning. So Waleed is not only a local artist who's created this beautiful mural called The Spirit, he actually hand-delivered all these prints to us, is also probably the nicest person. So we love Waleed, and we're really grateful, and we want to recognize him. All right, just a few announcements here to make your day go smoothly. We'll discuss here in just a minute. Couple things we are going to ask you to do. One is follow the schedule in your folder as it is. We've got limited space at breakout rooms, which you'll see in a moment. And so we just want to make sure that our breakout rooms are accessible and that our presenters know what to expect. So we're grateful for that. In your folders that you got today, packed by our amazing administrative assistant team led by Ashley Henning, there are note cards, and there's two of them. One is asking you about why you came here and what interested you about this, and another is about what you're going to commit to do as a result of being here and getting to that action and practice element. There are foam core boards around the building with pins sitting by them. As you fill those out, just stick those up on the foam core. You can remain anonymous. And we're just trying to get like a sense of why people came to an event like this and how we can support you going forward as a RISA. At the end of the day, you're going to be getting tons and tons and tons of swag here, including that Wally Johnson print that I told you about. You're getting notebooks, you're getting pens, you're getting books, including your book. So that's going to be so these text sets are going to be in the long hallway by where you came in. You would have a lanyard and a folder, and those are both the same color. There's a ribbon on the tote bags, and they're organized by color. Make sure you take your the color that matches your lanyard in your folder. So that way we'll keep everything in order. All of those tote bags, depending on what session you're attending tomorrow, have a little something different in them. So we want to make sure you get the right thing. Also, two things. On the back of your lanyard, which I don't have mine on, but in the back of your lanyard, you have some QR codes for surveys. We'd love if you take those at some point over the next couple of days. And our partners from MDE will also be outside, and they're going to be recording a little bit for anybody who's willing about, again, why you were here, why teaching diverse history is important to you. So they'd love to hear from you, and we would also. Also, last thing before we go, if you need any assistance whatsoever, please let one of our staff members know. We'll be happy to assist you. Many of us are wearing shirts with Wally Johnson's and John, so you can find one of those people, and the check-in desk is staffed all day long. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you in the breakouts. We appreciate it. One more hand for Dr.